Good evening. It is time for us to begin, so I'd like to welcome you to our midweek Bible study here at Peachtree City. Glad you're able to come and be with us tonight. As usual, we'll sing a couple of songs, and I believe Brother Tim is going to impart a message to us from God's Word. Another song after that, Ptccoc will give our closing prayer. Hope everybody's having a good week so far. Thank you again for being here. Number 400 is going to be our first song. We'll sing the first and the last verse. Just kind of give the altos a little bit of a heads up. I'll need your help in the chorus when you have that lead. Go ahead and sing out. There's a light on the pathway, it's guiding me home, into that eternal day. And it beckons me on when the pathway seems dark. There's a light that is shining for me. There's a light guiding me. There's a light guiding me through the darkness of midnight. Till morning I see. There's a light guiding me. He is guiding me home. The harbor I see, God safe in the fold. There's a light guiding me. I'm happy today and I'm nearer my home. There's a light that is shining for me. Just over the way is the mansion above. There's a light that is shining for me. There's a light guiding me. There's a light guiding me through the darkness of midnight. Till the morning I see. There's a light guiding me. There's a light guiding me. He is guiding me home. The harbor I see, till I'm safe in the fold. There's a light guiding me. 613. Hope God's unchanging hand. We'll see all three verses. Time is filled with swift transition, not of earth unto descent. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to God's unchanging hand. God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Trust in Him who shall not leave you. Whatsoever His may bring. If on earth things forsaken, still more closely to Him cling. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. When your journey is completed,
Good afternoon. Can y'all hear me? Better. I've got a lesson prepared that was not the lesson I intended to prepare. I read an article a few weeks ago about the manger, about what it was, and I wanted to tell you about it so much, but I lost the article. So I can't go back and reference it to make sure that everything I remember is correct. So I'm sorry, y'all missed that one, but it was good. I promise you. So I was telling Barbara about that a couple of days ago, and she said, well, why don't you just get the Bible, open it up, and make a lesson? I said, okay. So I got my Bible, the one with the cover almost torn off, and there was a piece of paper in the spots. I opened it to where that paper was. That was an old Thanksgiving lesson that I had done years and years ago about the tapestry of your life. Well, couldn't do that one. That was last week. But I did look to see where it was, and it just happened. It was Genesis 22. Now, there's a parallel within the Old and New Testament. I'd like to spend just a few moments tonight. But let me begin by saying, first of all, there is no way I can do this lesson justice. Not in the allotted time I have. Perhaps sometime in the future we can talk Chris into doing a lesson on it. But hopefully I can get your brainwaves headed in the right direction. Genesis 22:1 beginning. God decides to test Abraham. When he calls, Abraham answers, here I am. Then God tells him to take his son, Isaac, the son of promise, the son through whom Abraham's seed will be multiplied greater than the stars in the sky, and offer him as a burnt offering. So what did Abraham do? He arose the next morning, prepared what was necessary for the sacrifice, and along with two of his young men and Isaac, began the journey to where God said, go. Upon arrival, Abraham then telling his servants to, hear this now, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. That's verse 5. We will come back to you. Who was the sacrifice? Isaac. Yet Abraham says, we'll be back, both of us. Now note here that Abraham's instructions from God, again, is to sacrifice the lad, Isaac. In verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. I want you to particularly take note here of who carried the wood. Isaac, the sacrifice, carried the wood. Following in verse 7, but Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father? And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Continuing in verse 8, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Abraham's faith is already beginning to show. He knows. He hasn't been told, but he knows because he already knows the promise that God had made to him about Isaac. Somehow there would be a lamb sacrificed. Somehow Isaac would return. Now we know what happens next. Tied up, placed on the wood with a knife prepared to kill him. And an angel of the Lord calls out, Abraham, Abraham. And he says, here I am, Lord. Do the lad no harm. And then, in the bushes, Abraham notices a lamb. And they sacrifice the lamb. Now, let's move to the New Testament. Jesus, praying in the garden, sweat like blood. Father, if there be any other way. God answers him. He doesn't say God answers him, but God answers him. And how does he answer him? He doesn't say anything. The answer is, there is no other way. And Jesus knows this. So Jesus says, as Isaac did, Jesus does, as Isaac did, he bears the wood. He totes the cross. Look at the parallel there. Once again, God provided the lamb. This time, it was his son. The ultimate sin sacrifice. God provided the lamb. And he is risen and returned to the Father, as was Isaac to Abraham. Look at the parallel of those two stories. When I read that, I realized something that I had never noticed before. Isaac toted the wood. Jesus bore the cross. And God provided the sacrifice. If you have any need of the church tonight, prayers that we might offer, anything that we might do, or have a desire to perhaps be baptized, now will be the time as we begin to sing our invitation song.
As I love thee, I know thou art mine. For thee all the follies of sin I resign. My gracious Redeemer, my Savior art thou. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. I love thee because thou hast first loved me and purchased my pardon on Calvary's tree. I love thee for wearing the thorns on thy brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis now. In mansions heavens of glory and endless delight. I'll ever adore thee in heaven so bright. I'll sing with a glittering crown on my brow. If ever I love thee, my Jesus, 'tis now.
Please bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you so much for this wonderful day that you've given us, God, and all the blessings that we have day in and day out, Lord. Thank you for the ability to meet here in the middle of the week and worship you and learn from your word, God. We ask that you allow us to use the example of Abraham and Isaac to strengthen our faith in you, Lord. Help us to serve you and bring others to you, Lord. We ask you to be with us as we open and dive into your word this evening and allow us to glean from it everything to make us better Christians and to better serve you, Lord. These things we pray in your Son, our Savior's name. Amen.
All right. Are we up? Yeah, there we go. Woo. Hey, Aaron. How are you? Next week, we're going to talk about the judiciary. Yeah. We're not going to make it to there tonight. No, I just want you to be quiet. No. I want to get you started next week. All right, so the news is that the hometown holiday has been canceled because of the threat of rain, I guess. Is it supposed to rain on Saturday? It probably not now. They moved Santa Claus into City Hall and canceled everything on the field, including us and our cookies, of which I have 600. So, Leanne's going to use some cookies for the keepers. The cookies with Santa coming up. I think Caleb put out that we need some cookie volunteers and donations. We don't. We're good. If you just want a cookie, you can just get a cookie. I don't know. Can I freeze them and they last till next year? No. I'm getting no, because they're good. Like they're not junky cookies. They're pretty good cookies. They probably have like real butter. I got way more no's than yeses. Although for that event, I bet it wouldn't matter. Most of them are going to end up on the ground. So we did have a batch last year before. They got before I could put them up, they got ants in them, and had to throw away like 150 cookies. That was terrible. But they were Kroger, so not that good. These are actually good cookies. So anyway, we got cookies. I'll go open the box after we're done here. All right, a couple weeks ago, we got to the point where we crossed over the Red Sea, and we're still studying Exodus, by the way. I'm going to keep going until we're done. I told y'all the quarter doesn't mean much to me, so I'm just going to keep going, even into December or whenever. And if you just want to go straight into like Judges after that, we'll do that, and right into Joshua. We'll just keep going into the Promised Land. It's fine with me. So we're going to pick up in chapter 16 tonight. We talked about the Song of Moses last week, and we're going to move into chapter 16. Couple of things we'll talk about. Let's kind of look and see where we are. You remember that when we were talking about the Red Sea crossing, what I suggested, let's go to that map. What I suggested is that they actually crossed the western side, that's the eastern side, that little Finger Lake kind of deal that comes up there that's part of the Red Sea, and that's Red Sea on the west or on the left, and then the big Red Sea is down at the bottom. Probably what we were taught growing up is they crossed somewhere up where Egypt touches the Sinai Peninsula, but there, for me, is just not enough water there. And so I think that they crossed over on that eastern part, the Sea of Aqaba, I believe it is. I probably say it wrong every time. I probably say it different every time, actually. And that also holds up with where Midian would be, which is where he went to visit Jethro. And so anyway, that puts Mount Sinai not down in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula there, but actually over toward the east, across the Red Sea. So they are there, and they are encamped at Elim. It's been about a month and a half coming out of Egypt. Pharaoh's gone. He's dead. He's not coming back. There's no more hardening his heart. His heart is at the bottom of the Red Sea, along with the rest of his army. And so the Egyptians are now completely out of the picture. And we don't really hear anything significant about Egypt again until Jesus flees to Egypt. Which is a cool parallel, by the way, that he goes to Egypt and comes back into the Promised Land, until the New Testament. So let's pick up in Exodus chapter 16. That begins with verse 2. Verse 1 says, they journeyed from Elim. All the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then, when the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out to this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Kind of the same argument they made when they were being pursued by Pharaoh, and there was a big ocean in front, mountains all around, and an army behind them ready to kill them. You brought us out here for us to die. And I jumped down to verse 8 there because this is interesting. It says, also Moses said, this shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full, for the Lord hears your complaints which you made against him. What are we? Your complaints are not against us, but of the Lord. So I bring that up because they always complain to Moses, and Moses always deflects to God. Moses wants them to know that because you're out here, and if you die, and if things don't work out, I didn't do it, it was God. I think that's very interesting. And he deflects, and he always goes to God and says, these people are about to kill me, or they're complaining against me. But he always makes it very clear to the people, don't blame me, blame God. And he does that here as well. So, let's jump to the next verse. Then the Lord said to Moses, this is back in verse 3, that verse 8 was just a little insert there. Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. All right, so this is the initial instruction from God. It's repeated several times throughout the chapter. We're not going to read through the entire chapter. We'll bring out some highlights here and talk about this in just a moment. But God answers, right? And he says, I'm going to provide bread, and that bread is called manna. All right? Why is it called manna? Well, in the last bullet there is actually the pronunciation in Hebrew, manhu. Manha means what is it? And we find out there in around verse 15, I believe, it says, so the children of Israel saw it, and they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, this is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Later on in the chapter, it tells us because they said the what is it, it actually is the Hebrew word pronounced manna, and that's how manna got its name. In verse 14, a couple things about the manna. Verse 14, we see it says, and when the layer of dew lifted on the surface of the wilderness was small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So it was left behind each morning as the dew lifted. There was this white stuff on the ground. It says it was small and round and fine as frost. Go down to verse 31. Verse 31, and the house of Israel called its name manna, and it was like white coriander seed, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So white coriander seed and like wafers made with honey. Apparently it was, and we will look in Numbers chapter 11 here in a minute, it tells us that they could take that seed and they were able to grind it up and make cakes out of it. They could boil them or they could bake them, and apparently it tasted like honey wafers, which doesn't sound terrible, to be honest with you. And then in verse 21, it tells us that once the day got warm, that the rest of the manna that was not gathered that day would just melt away. So it's a very interesting substance. It's not something that is natural. It's not something that can be explained naturally. I don't think we have seen manna occur in nature before or after this. So that tells us, again, this is a supernatural occurrence that God is causing, whether you want to try to explain it away or not. And so with all this, learning about what this manna is, what it looked like, I remember I did a class, I think it was like the 4th and 5th grade or 3rd through 5th grade on a Wednesday night, maybe last year. Ellie was in there, and I actually made manna and quail for them. None of the kids had ever eaten quail, and I told them they all had to try it. And these little quails were like split in the breast, and they were like laid out with their little legs poking up, and I baked them and seasoned them and all, and it's not terrible. Ellie loved it, by the way. I don't know if has she asked for quail since, because she asked for seconds. She liked the quail. But they all ate a little bite. The honey wafer thing was harder to do, though. It was harder to kind of come up with this white thing. You could grind it into a bread, and it tastes like honey, but I think I bought some crackers and put honey on them, so we made it work. Anyway, all that to say that this is the description of what this manna looked like, and that God said that every morning when they go out, it's going to be there for them to gather, provided by God. We'll look at that a little later on. But with this manna came some rules, actual rules. So go to verse 16. So 16:16. It said, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's need, 1 omer for each person according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. Okay? So gather according to each one's need. And then he says to get 1 omer per person for however many people are in the tent. So that is how much they gathered. Interesting thing, at the very end of the chapter in verse 36, it says, now an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. Now, I don't have those measurements. I just think it's really funny that Moses goes through this entire description of everything that goes on, and before he closes out this little section, he says, oh, by the way, an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. It's like you've been wondering the whole time, well, Moses, how much is this omer? But what we find out is it's exactly how much one person needs for that day. If they gathered more, it was exactly how much they needed. If they gathered less, they gathered as much as they needed. It was miraculous all the way around. I think that's neat. But rule number 1 is that you only gather what you need for that person and for each person in your tent. The next rule down in verse 19, Moses said, let no one leave any of it till the morning. Now, right after that in verse 20, notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until the morning, and it bred worms, and it stank, and Moses was angry with them. So if you kept it overnight, and you go to your little omer bowl, and you pick it up, and you say, well, I'll go get some more manna, well, it's going to have this nasty, green, moldy, maggoty, probably is what the worms were, this rotten manna, because God said to get rid of it. You didn't, it's going to rot. So this is not something you can save up until the next day, until it's Friday. So verse 22, yes? Okay. So David's footnote says an omer is about 2 quarts. 2 quarts. 2 quarts of bread per day. 3 pounds. How many pounds is a quart? I don't know the answer to that question. I know a gallon is 8 pounds. Right. Then you got liquid compared to dry measurement, and that's a whole big thing. So I don't know. I've got a chart on the refrigerator. It's a magnet that tells me all this. And so without that, I can't help you. So somewhere between 2 quarts and 3 pounds. It didn't weigh much. It couldn't, because it said it was as fine as the frost. And so you can imagine how much of this stuff you got to pick up to get 3 pounds of it. It's 8 pounds. Well, there you go. 3 pounds or 2 quarts. If it weighs the same as water. So very good. All right. We got that all worked out. Verse 19. Let's go to verse 19. We just read verse 9. Let no one leave any until the morning, because it's going to rot. Go to verse 22. Sorry about that. So it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. So that'd be a gallon, I guess. 2 omers for each one, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept till the morning. So they laid up till the morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Moses said in verse 25, eat that today, for today is the Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find in the field. You will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. Of course, they go out, some of the folks on the Sabbath to gather. In the next verse, it tells us that there's not any. So both times, God said, don't do this thing. Some people tried it. I think that's probably natural. There's probably people in this room that would have kept it overnight to see what happened. And there's probably people in this room that would have gone out on Saturday morning to see if there was any manna, to find that there was no manna. That was kind of that part of the test, when God says, I'm going to give them this bread, yes, to feed them, but also to test their faith. And that was part of that test. We see the Sabbath is initiated, all right? And the interesting thing about that is we don't really see the Sabbath as being part of the law until the law is given, coming up in verse 19, with the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But we do have an example of the Sabbath before this. Where's that? At creation. Back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, he rested on the 7th day. And so what we have is kind of the fulfillment of that for God's people. And even with the manna, he says, listen, you guys aren't going to gather on the 7th day, on Saturday. We're going to gather enough for 2 days on Friday. There's not going to be need to gather, and there's not going to be nothing to gather. There won't be anything to gather as well. So those are the rules that came along with the manna. It's pretty interesting stuff, I think. All right, a little bit more on manna. The daily quota was a test of faith. God said, He said, I'm going to rain bread from heaven, back in verse 4, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. They haven't received the law yet, according to the narrative. And this is a test on how they might receive the law, how they're going to follow the law of God. And what we see is that they test God back, right? God is testing them, but several people are going to keep it overnight, and they're going to check on Saturday to see if there was any manna. I don't know if that means they didn't gather enough on Friday. Maybe they didn't gather but the one omer, just thinking that it's going to be there, but it wasn't. And so this is a part of this test that God is talking about. And the manna was a demonstration that God brought them out of Egypt. It also says, let's see, in verse 6, it says, Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, at the evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. In the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, that He hears your complaints against the Lord. So what we see here is that God providing this miraculously, right? This is Him demonstrating once again, everything that has happened up until this point was by the hand of God. And God is going to lead you through the desert. God is going to lead you through the wilderness. God is going to provide everything you need. God is going to hear you when you complain. And this is part of, if He's providing food every day, the way He's providing food every day, then it was God who divided the Red Sea. If it was God who divided the Red Sea, then it was God who passed over our houses and killed the Egyptians. If it was God who did that, He did all the other 10 plagues. And so it's validation and verification that Moses is indeed the speaker of the Lord, even though they always complain directly to Moses and blame things on him, and he turns it around on them. And then we know that the manna lasted for 40 years, lasted the whole time that they wandered. In Joshua chapter 5, down in verse 12, where we find them is they've crossed over the Jordan, right? You remember that's the second time they're going to go through the water and crossing over Jordan into the promised land. And that's another one of those parallels we can draw between us as Christians and the Israelites going into the promised land. They've crossed over, and what they did is they ate vegetables from the land. And once they ate those vegetables from the land, it says the manna ceased. In verse 12 of Joshua 5, then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan that year. And so this went all the way until, so every single morning for 40 years, they go out and gather bread. They go out and gather their bread. So, about a bit more about manna. Could there be any more about manna? A few things come to mind when I think about manna. And I, when you read this and you start thinking about bread and the significance of bread, bread's a staple. You don't have to eat bread to live. I don't eat a lot of bread. I don't eat any bread, really, by choice. Some people can't eat bread. But you can live on bread. Okay, so you can classify it as a staple, and you can see a lot of examples of the use of bread. When we use the term breaking bread together, what do we mean? Well, we're eating together. Okay, so it represents food. It represents nourishment. Things come to mind when I think about it is a couple of statements. As man shall not live by bread alone, give us this day our daily bread, and I am the bread of life. And those are all New Testament statements talking about bread, and they do relate to the manna. And so let's look at those, each one a little bit closer. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, starting in verse 2, it says, and you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you. Same thing God said back in Exodus chapter 16. To know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. So He humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know. They didn't know what it was. Remember, what is it? That He might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell for these 40 years. Where else have we heard that passage? Not the whole passage, it was just the end of verse 3. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jesus says that when Satan says, turn these stones into bread. And He had fasted for 40 days. They wandered for 40 years, so there's a correlation there. And the very basic of nutrition, Satan says, listen, just turn the rocks into bread, Jesus, and you'll be fine. And Jesus quotes this from Deuteronomy, man shall not live by bread alone. So what we find is the fact that they were wandering in the desert, and the lesson or the test for them, it says that God humbled them and allowed them to be hungry. He allowed them to need things. And what they found out by needing food and drink and protection from enemies, and we'll get into that in chapter 17, is that they learned that while God fed them, it wasn't just the bread that kept them alive for 40 years in the wilderness. It was God. It was God. You shall not live by bread alone, but you will keep the commandments of God. And those commandments were given to them while they're wandering in the wilderness during this same time. And so man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. It takes you back, it took them back to the manna that God provided. It is like saying God provided. Matthew 6:11, give us this day our daily bread. It's part of the Lord's Prayer. And it's in the way the thing I like about this is it's our daily bread. And how did they receive the manna? Daily. They didn't get more than they needed. They didn't have less than they needed. Everyone had what they needed. Now, obviously, they collected 2 days' worth on Friday, and that was fine. That was a command from God. But God provided their daily needs. And when you get into that and you kind of think through that and you understand that you're asking in a model prayer from Jesus, Lord, give me what I need for today. That's all I need to ask. And God protects and God takes care of every single day, day by day. When Jesus talks about worry, right? He says, what's it going to help? You can't add one hair to your head by worrying. Today has enough trouble. And you start worrying about tomorrow and adding trouble. Give us today our daily bread. And that manna was their daily bread. Another reference there is John chapter 6. John chapter 6. I think we have 30 up here. I'll begin in verse 26 of John chapter 6. As Jesus answered them, and he said, most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and were filled. This is a group of people that found him the day after he fed the 5,000. So what Jesus says there is that you're looking for me not because of all the wonders you saw, or not the miracles, you're just looking for another free meal. That's what he's really saying, because you ate all the loaves and the fish and you were filled. Do not labor for food which perishes, but for food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. Verse 28, then they said to him, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? Jesus answered and said, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. That's Jesus. Verse 30, therefore they said to him, what sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe it? What work will you do? So they kind of throw that back on Jesus. Remember, he said, you didn't come to see the signs, you just came to eat again. And they're like, okay, show us a sign then. In verse 31, our fathers ate manna in the desert, as is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. So they actually refer to the miracle of the manna. And they say, well, okay, what sign are you going to do? Because we know that God provided bread for them. It's interesting, though, that they sat there the day before. Maybe they didn't know Jesus was miraculously providing the 5 loaves and 2 fish and kept reproducing it for these people. They just thought he had that much food carrying around with him and his apostles. But they're asking, what sign are you going to do? Because God did a sign for his people. He provided manna in the desert, and he gave them bread from heaven, is what they use, the term to describe it. Jesus said to them in verse 32, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven. That's interesting. But my Father gives you true bread from heaven, for the bread of God is he, that's Jesus, who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. They said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. So Jesus takes the reference to the manna, being bread from heaven. We would all describe that as bread from heaven, being a miraculous bread that nourished and took care of his people in the desert as they wandered. And he says that I am the bread from heaven, right? And it kind of it makes me think of the woman at the well. You know, he's talking about the living water. Same sort of thing here. He says that I am the bread of heaven, the real bread from heaven. So he compares himself to that manna that God provided, and he talks about the result of that is he's the bread of life, and he who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. So those are some parallels, I guess, you can draw from the New Testament, one from the Old, but is quoted in the New Testament in Matthew 4, that think back to the manna and actually refer back to the manna that was given to them in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 16. So it's pretty interesting there. Now, one thing is interesting too is they also got quail. It's only mentioned once as quail. It's mentioned twice in this chapter as meat. They said, I'm going to give you meat at night, and then he says the meat is going to be quail. There's no rules on the quail. Why are there so many rules on the manna, but no rules on the quail? I don't know the answer to that. I can just tell you that there's no rules about the quail. Now, to talk about that, though, we do need to go over to Numbers chapter 11. Let's go to Numbers chapter 11. And if this narrative is laid out in order, and this is what's kind of, it's kind of confusing, honestly, when you read through this. When you read Numbers chapter 10, we find that they have departed Sinai, okay? But then you get into Numbers chapter 11, and he starts talking about manna and quail. Now, back in Exodus chapter 16, we have not made it to Sinai yet. Yet they're talking about manna and quail. It could be that what happens in chapter 11, and I think there's some evidence to this, there may be some evidence to this, that this is a different instance, that this is something that happened later after the manna was given and after the quail was given. So let's read a few passages from Numbers 11. I don't have that on the board, so we can just read through that. Now, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. So literally the fire of the Lord, meaning it actually, you could read that to say that it killed people and also destroyed maybe some tents and things like that on the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses. When Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. Now, the mixed multitude. And who has an English Standard Version? Does it say rabble? Is that the right word if you have an ESV? Rabble? Okay. So that's clue number one, that there is a small group of people. All the people were not the rabble. Okay, the riffraff maybe is a good word for that. But it seems to be a small group of people are about to start some trouble. And this is what, for me, tells me that chapter 11 of Numbers is a separate event from chapter 16 of Exodus. And you can disagree with that. We can discuss it. I don't think there's a clear answer, either way. So the mixed multitude who are among them yielded to the intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again, saying, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. So they're remembering all the great food they had in Egypt. Sounds like they ate pretty good for 1.5 million slaves. But now our whole being is dried up. There's nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. And so it seems like the manna has been established, at least. Okay. The manna was like coriander seed, and its color was like the color of bdellium. There's really nothing that we know of that is bdellium today to compare that to, best I could tell, everything I read. And so maybe I don't know if it's a different color than the white, or maybe not. But it does describe it as the coriander seed as well. You may have a footnote on that. The people went about and gathered it, ground it on millstones or beat it on the mortar, cooked it in pans, made cakes of it, and its taste was like the taste of pastry prepared with oil. So where it said it tasted like kind of a honey wafer, it calls it a pastry here. So I think you get that same idea. You can say that they're talking about the same thing. There's not a conflict. Then when the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna fell on it. Then Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, and everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. Moses was also displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, why have you afflicted your servant, and why have you not found favor in your sight, that the people that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? So he hears the complaining, and it, going back to the first few verses, that complaining was from this rabble, from a group. And it seems like they have now spread it through the camp, and maybe more people are starting to complain and be upset that they're eating a bunch of manna. Several things happen. Let's jump down. Go to verse 18. Then you shall say to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. And this is God talking to Moses. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat, not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils, and it becomes loathsome, because you have despised the Lord who is among you, and you've wept before him, saying, why did we ever come out of Egypt? So God says, you want to eat meat? I'm going to give you meat, and I'm going to give you more meat than you can possibly handle. And he does. Let's see. We'll keep in verse 21, that's fine. And Moses said to the people, who I am among the 600,000 men on foot, yet you have said, I will give them meat, and they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to provide enough for them, or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to provide enough for them? And the Lord said to Moses, has the Lord's arm been shortened? Now you shall see whether what I say will happen to you or not. So Moses actually asked, are we going to eat the herds and the flocks? Are we going to eat our sheep and our cattle? And the answer is no, and the answer is no because the sheep and the cattle, where did we come? It was almost 2 million people when we did all the math. You got over 600,000 men, and you add, maybe a wife for every one of them, and then you start adding kids in there. We're reaching a couple million people. You remember with those numbers, I think it was going to be 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water per day for that group of people. That's very significant at the beginning of chapter 17. They didn't have enough cattle and sheep to feed them very long, especially for 40 years. They also used them for sacrifices. I don't think everybody came out with like 200 head of cattle. Can you imagine? 600,000 families, and they all have, 20 cows. Do the math. That's a lot of animals just following you around. They probably shared those flocks and herds among the tribes. It's not enough meat. So even Moses is saying, listen, are we going to eat all our cows? Are we going to eat all our sheep? Is that how you're going to do this? And God says, listen, don't insult me and say that I can't do this, basically. He said, have you shortened the arm of the Lord? I think that's pretty funny language from God. So he gathers up these elders. They go outside the camp. The Lord comes down in a cloud, and he talks to Moses a little bit. Down in verse 28, it says, Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, and one of his choice men. This is one of the first times we see Joshua mentioned, and I think that's significant. And so it tells us who Joshua is, even all the way back to Sinai. He was there. Moses said to him, are you zealous for my sake? Oh, that the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord and his spirit upon him. Moses returned to the camp, both he and the elders of Israel. Now wind went from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side, and about a day's journey on the other side. And all the camp about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. And people stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, or homers, however you want to say that. They spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So he called the name of the place Kilbroth Hadavah, because there they buried the people who had yielded to the craving. So that's another clue. It says they buried some of those who received a plague from God because of this quail. So that tells you that rabble of people, that group of people, it seems to have stirred everybody up. They're the ones that suffered the plague, and they're the ones that were left there and buried. Now, were they already eating quail? Because in Exodus 16, we see that they're going to get quail at night. They're going to get manna in the morning. Here in Numbers 11, it shows up that, looking at chapter 10, that this was after Sinai. Okay, so you have two instances of this quail happening. In Numbers 11, the quail were given by God really out of anger, right? And he said, you're going to have more meat. And it says that they were, when it talked about them being, 2 cubits high, I don't know that it meant that the quail were literally, waist high, that they had to wade through it. That's disgusting, and it's a lot of birds. It's more along the lines of these migratory patterns of these birds. They would come and land in certain areas around the Mediterranean, and when they landed, they were tired, and they really couldn't fly much higher. That's why people could walk up and catch them. And so that's kind of but they surrounded the camp about a day's journey. They didn't land in the camp. And so that's another clue where in Exodus chapter 16, it says that they were going to be in the camp, and they could go out and get them. Here we see that they're about a day's journey out, and they had to bring them back. So how the two things align, I don't think anybody's 100% sure. I think it's two different instances, maybe even to the point where they were tired of eating quail and asking for different meat. And God only gave them quail again. And the ones who caused all that disturbance, he also, while they were eating that quail that they collected, more quail than they could even wrap their head around, he had a plague come and took care of that rabble or that small group of people that caused all this trouble within the camp. So anyway, that's a little bit about the quail. Again, back in Exodus 16, not a lot of mention of the quail, not a lot of rules around the quail, other than at night they come in, collect your birds. Apparently you could keep them till the next day. I don't know, maybe they salted them or whatever you do to preserve a bird. And then the manna obviously had a lot more rules, a lot more significance. And the last thing we'll mention about the manna is that they collected some of the manna and they kept it. And they kept it, let's go back to Exodus 16, and we'll close with that. And we'll start on 17 next week. 17 is cool. They get water from the rock, and then they fight a battle. So that's pretty fun. Verse 33, it says, Moses said to Aaron, take a pot and put an omer of manna in it and lay it up before the Lord to be kept for your generations. And as the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron laid up before the testimony to be kept. The children of Israel ate manna 40 years till they came to inhabit the land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. And I will leave you with that fact. We'll close there. All right, thank you all very much. Have a good rest of your week. Guess I need to go open the cookie box.